All right, so have you ever launched a product and like just heard crickets?
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
It happens, it even happened to Eric Ries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the author of The Lean Startup. But his flop, it actually sparked a whole new approach to building businesses. One that helps you kind of navigate all that uncertainty
Yeah,
and avoid those, facepalm moments.
for sure.
So that's what we're diving into today.
Okay.
The core principles of the Lean Startup with real-world examples that I think are going to make you rethink how you approach, well, pretty much anything you're building.
I love that. You know, what's really exciting about this method is how it reframes what a startup even is.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about being small or, tech focused. It's about tackling something new when you don't have all the answers. And
Yeah,
that
okay.
applies even inside, a massive company.
So it's not the size of the company, it's the size of the unknown,
Exactly.
right? Like Intuit, the financial software giant.
Huge company.
Yeah, they use these principles to create SnapTax, the mobile app.
Yeah.
That was a total departure from their usual stuff.
Yeah, totally. And that's actually where traditional business plans often go wrong.
Oh, how so?
Well, they try to predict the future, but
Yeah.
when you're in uncharted territory, that's pretty much impossible.
Right.
So the lean startup is embrace the unknown, learn as you go. It's more like learning to drive.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Right.
So less about plotting every turn on the map and more about adjusting to the road as you go.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you steer, in the business world?
Well, with something Ries calls validated learning. So instead of just hitting milestones, you really focus on what each step teaches you about your customer.
Okay.
Like take IMVU, for example.
Yeah.
That was Ries's own 3D avatar chat platform.
Okay.
They assumed that users would want instant messaging built in. But it turned out teenagers, they wanted the opposite.
Oh,
They
yeah.
wanted a way to meet new people, not chat with existing friends.
Wow, talk about a reality check. They could have spent months building that IM feature, only to find out it was totally off the mark.
Exactly. And that brings us to a cornerstone of the lean startup, the minimum viable product,
The MVP.
the MVP.
Now, I know some folks hear minimum and they think cheap or unfinished,
Yeah.
but it's not about that, is it?
No, it's not about that at all. It's about building the simplest version that lets you test those core assumptions about what customers want.
Okay.
It's like when Groupon started, they used handmade PDFs and pizza coupons. It was basic, but it proved the concept.
So are you saying that a simple, even ugly MVP can be more valuable than a polished product that nobody wants?
Absolutely. It's all about getting that real feedback as early as possible. Another great example is Zappos. They just tested if people would buy shoes online. Turns out they were way more open to it than anyone thought, which is something that traditional market research totally missed.
Interesting. Okay, so the MVP lets you get out of the building and test those assumptions in the real world. But then how do you measure if you're on the right track?
Yeah.
Is it just about sales numbers?
Not necessarily. You need metrics that track learning and progress towards a sustainable business. So traditional accounting focuses on profits. But for startups, it's all about actionable metrics, which are things that reveal customer behavior and help you make decisions based on, data, not hunches.
Can you give me an example of that difference?
Sure. So think of Grocket, the online education platform.
Okay.
So they were tracking total users and questions answered, but those were actually vanity metrics.
Oh, okay.
They looked good on paper, but they didn't really show how to improve the product or attract the right customers.
So it's like feeling fit because you bought a fancy scale, but you haven't actually changed your habits.
Uh-huh.
The
Yeah.
number's meaningless without the right action.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes this data tells you it's time for a major shift, what Ries calls a pivot. And that's not admitting defeat. It's using what you've learned to adjust course.
So it's less we failed
Yeah.
and more like, okay, that didn't work. What does this new data tell us to try next?
Exactly. Vodafone, the civic engagement platform, they pivoted multiple times.
Wow.
And each time they got faster because they were getting better at, applying what they'd learned.
This is making me realize that the lean startup is more than just, a product launch checklist.
Yeah.
It's really about building a culture of constant testing and improvement. But isn't there a danger of just getting lost in all that experimenting?
Yeah.
Like, how do you know which direction to go?
Well, that's where understanding those different engines of growth comes in.
Okay.
Ries identifies three main types: sticky, viral, and paid.
Okay, so the sticky engine, that's about keeping customers coming back, right?
Yeah.
Like Facebook's addictive news feed, right? They've got that hook that keeps people engaged.
Right. And then there's the viral engine where customers bring in new customers.
Uh,
So think about how Hotmail took off. They added that get your free email link to every outgoing email.
oh, yeah,
It's like pure viral marketing genius.
totally. And then the paid engine
Yeah.
is where you're spending money to acquire customers,
Right.
like through advertising.
Right. Google Ads is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, so it's about picking your battles, not trying to win on all fronts at once, right?
Yeah.
But with all this pivoting and iterating, wouldn't that feel chaotic inside a company?
It could.
Like, how do you manage that?
Well, structure and discipline are still super important, especially as you grow. One tool Ries introduces is the 5 whys technique.
Oh, I've heard of that. You keep asking why until you get to the root cause of the problem. But how does that apply to startups specifically?
It's actually really powerful. It often reveals that those seemingly technical issues are actually human issues. Imagine a website keeps crashing. You ask why 5 times and you discover.
That it's not the code, it's that the team's communication is terrible and nobody knows who's responsible for what.
Exactly. Then you can address the real problem, not just the symptom. So the 5 whys help you target your efforts where they matter most.
This is making me think about how we tackle problems in all areas of life, not just business.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we've got constant experimenting, learning from data, and digging for those root causes. Anything else that makes the lean startup unique?
Yeah. Ries also stresses the importance of small batches. It's inspired by lean manufacturing, and it's about breaking work down into smaller chunks so you can get feedback faster.
This reminds me of that story in the book about stuffing envelopes.
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but completing one envelope at a time, from folding to stamping, was actually faster than doing each step in big batches.
Exactly. It's because you eliminate those delays and handoffs. And Ries says this applies to everything. Marketing, research, internal processes. The faster you go through that build, measure, learn loop, the faster you adapt.
Like that whole slow is smooth, smooth is fast idea applied to business. So it's not about rushing. It's about being smart with your effort. But what happens when a startup needs to grow beyond that early stage? How do you keep that agility as you get bigger?
Well, that's where the concept of the innovation sandbox comes in.
Okay.
It's a dedicated space where teams can experiment without getting bogged down by all that bureaucracy. We'll dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm already hooked. Can't wait to explore how you keep that startup spirit alive, even inside a massive company. All right, we're back. And I'm still thinking about those small batches, how they can actually speed things up. It's like a paradox.
It really is.
But before we get too deep into the how of the lean startup,
Okay.
I'm curious about how you measure success
Yeah.
when you're constantly experimenting and maybe even changing direction. Isn't that kind of tricky?
You've hit on a key point there. The lean startup really challenges how we define success.
Okay.
It's not just about hitting some target.
Right.
It's about constantly learning and adapting along the way.
So you're not failing. You're gathering data.
You got it.
So instead of aiming for that perfect launch,
Yeah.
it's more about getting something out there and just seeing what happens.
Exactly. And this is where innovation accounting comes in.
Okay.
Remember those actionable metrics we talked about?
Yeah.
They're crucial for determining if you're actually moving towards a sustainable business model or if you're just, spinning your wheels.
So it's not just about whether the numbers are going up or down,
Right.
but what those numbers are telling you about your customers and what they're actually doing, not just what we hope they'll do.
Precisely. It reminds me of the early days of Facebook.
Okay.
A lot of people were criticizing them for not having a clear revenue model.
Right.
They weren't making much money, at least relative to their valuation.
Oh, yeah.
And people were saying, oh, they're just chasing users.
But isn't that a risky strategy?
Yeah.
How can you build a sustainable business if you don't have a clear way to make money?
Well, what those critics missed was that Facebook was building a powerful engine of growth. They had a massive, highly engaged audience.
Okay.
And that's incredibly valuable, even if the revenue strategy wasn't, fully figured out yet.
So their value hypothesis was strong, even if their revenue model was still, in development.
Exactly.
It's like they were building the car while they were learning to drive it.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights why it's so important to understand those different engines of growth that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Each has its own strengths and challenges.
Right. The sticky, the viral, and the paid engine.
Exactly.
Maybe we should just remind our listener what each one is about. So the sticky engine, That's the one that keeps customers coming back for more.
Right.
Think Netflix or Spotify.
Yeah.
They hook you with those personalized recommendations
Yeah.
and a constantly updated library of content.
Exactly. And the beauty of a sticky engine is that it reduces your reliance on, constantly having to acquire new customers. Your existing users are your biggest asset.
Love it. Okay, then there's the viral engine, where growth is all driven by your customers spreading the word.
Right.
Like those early PayPal referral bonuses,
Yep.
that was classic viral marketing.
Oh, yeah.
Or even those like old school Tupperware parties.
Yeah.
Prime example of word of mouth marketing in action.
A well-executed viral loop can lead to explosive growth.
Totally.
But it's not just about luck,
Yeah.
You got to design your product or service in a way that actually encourages sharing and those referrals.
Okay. And lastly, we have the paid engine. That's all about using money to acquire those customers
Yeah.
through things like advertising or, a dedicated sales force. Google Ads is a perfect example.
Right. And while the paid engine might seem pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
it actually requires really careful management.
Okay.
You need to make sure that your customer lifetime value, or LTV, is higher than your cost per acquisition,
Or CPA.
your CPA. Otherwise, you're literally just throwing money away.
So it's not just about spending money.
Right.
It's about spending it smartly
Exactly.
and making sure that each new customer is ultimately profitable for the business.
You got it. And it's also important to remember that a company can use multiple engines of growth.
Right.
But as we discussed earlier, it's usually most effective to focus on optimizing one at a time.
Okay, so we've got the what of measuring success,
Yeah.
which are these different engines of growth.
Yeah.
But what about the how? How do you stay adaptable and responsive in a market that's constantly changing?
Well, Ries emphasizes the importance of those small batches
Right.
to maintain that agility. So it's about breaking that work down into manageable chunks,
Okay.
getting feedback quickly, and iterating based on what you learn.
It's that envelope stuffing story. That one really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Completing one envelope at a time from start to finish
Yeah.
was actually faster than doing all the folding and sealing and stamping in separate batches.
It is, and it seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about all those delays and handoffs that come with large batches. And it just creates bottlenecks
Right.
and slows down that entire process.
And it applies to more than just stuffing envelopes.
Oh, totally.
Right. So Ries argues that this small batch principle is relevant to all areas of a startup,
Yeah.
not just product development.
Yeah.
So instead of a designer churning out 30 designs before getting feedback,
Yeah.
they might share just, 3 designs with the engineers early on, get their input, and then iterate from there.
Exactly. Smaller batches lead to faster feedback loops, quicker iteration, and ultimately more efficient progress.
It's all about building that build, measure, learn loop into every aspect of your work.
You got it.
It's making me think about how I approach projects in my own life, Maybe I should try breaking things down into smaller chunks and get that feedback more often.
I think that's a great idea.
But how do you create a company culture that really embraces this kind of constant experimentation? Isn't there a risk of things feeling chaotic?
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about implementing tools and techniques. It's about fostering that mindset of continuous learning and adaptation.
Okay.
So Ries talks about building an adaptive organization,
Okay.
which is one that's comfortable with change and doesn't punish failure.
So it's less about ping pong tables and beanbag chairs.
Yeah,
And more about having those systems in place
exactly.
that encourage teams to experiment, learn from their mistakes, and, adjust their approach accordingly.
That's exactly right. It's about creating that environment where people feel safe to try new things,
Yeah.
knowing that not everything is going to work out perfectly the first time.
I'm imagining a team that's actually excited to share their work in progress,
Yeah.
get that feedback, and iterate instead of feeling like they have to hide their mistakes
Yeah.
or pretend that everything is going perfectly according to plan.
That's the ideal. And to support this kind of culture, Ries suggests creating a dedicated space for experimentation. He calls it the innovation sandbox.
We've touched on this concept briefly,
Yeah.
but I'm eager to dig a little bit deeper into how it works in practice.
Okay.
So, what exactly is an innovation sandbox?
Okay.
And how do you create one that actually fosters, that disruptive thinking?
That's a great question. And it's one that we'll explore in detail in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at some real-world examples and discuss the key principles for building an effective innovation sandbox.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I'm picturing a space where teams can really let loose,
Yeah.
explore those what-if ideas
Yeah.
without that fear of disrupting the core business.
Let's dive in. Okay, so we've talked about MVPs, pivoting, all those powerful engines of growth. It's a lot to juggle, but even the most agile startup, they eventually have to become a real business.
Right.
How do you scale up but keep that experimental spirit alive?
Well, it's a challenge that Eric Ries calls cultivating the management portfolio. It's like juggling different types of work all at the same time. Keeping the lights on today, but also building for a completely different tomorrow.
Okay, I can see how that gets tricky.
Right.
Where do you even begin? Well, Rees, he breaks it down into four main categories. First, you have the ongoing optimization of your existing products or services. This is like the day-to-day stuff. Improving efficiency, fixing bugs, responding to customer feedback.
So keeping that engine humming, making sure that what's already working is still working well. What's next?
Next is scaling successful innovations. So this is where you take those small experiments that really prove themselves, and then you figure out how to bring them to the masses.
Which probably means building new teams, new systems, processes, basically leveling up the whole operation.
Yeah,
That sounds intense.
it can be. And then, of course, you have to fend off the competition, because once you've found some success, others are going to try to copy you or come up with their own version of what you're doing.
So you can't just rest on your laurels. You've got to keep innovating to stay ahead of the game.
Yeah,
But there's a fourth category, right? Something about disrupting yourself.
that's right. The fourth type of work is nurturing disruptive innovations. So these are those game-changing ideas that could actually end up cannibalizing your existing business.
Whoa. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. Why would you invest in something that might undermine your current success?
Because if you don't disrupt yourself, someone else will.
Right.
It's like the innovator's dilemma. Established companies often struggle with this because it feels like you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
But Rees argues that it's essential for long-term survival.
So it's about being proactive,
Right.
recognizing that the market's always changing,
Yeah.
and being willing to, shake things up, even when you're already successful.
Exactly.
But how do you do that without throwing the whole company into chaos?
Well, this is where that innovation sandbox that we keep mentioning comes in.
All right.
It's a dedicated space where teams can experiment with these potentially disruptive ideas without being bogged down by bureaucracy or
Yeah.
that fear of failure.
Okay, I'm really curious about this. It sounds like you're giving a team permission to break things, but in a controlled environment. How does that actually work?
So think of it like a mini startup within a larger company.
Okay.
So teams in the sandbox, they have a high degree of autonomy, and they're encouraged to try things that might seem crazy or risky from the perspective of the core business.
It reminds me of how Intuit developed SnapTax,
Yes,
their mobile tax app. It was a total departure from their, traditional desktop software.
exactly.
Yeah.
They were able to do that because they were given that island of freedom to experiment. They weren't bound by those same rules and processes as the rest of the company.
So they were able to move faster, take more risks, and ultimately create something truly innovative.
Exactly.
But isn't it a little risky to just let a team, run wild like that? What if they go off the rails?
Well, it's not about giving them unlimited freedom. The sandbox still needs structure and some guidance. Rees outlines 3 key attributes that are essential for success.
Okay, lay 'em on me. What are those magic ingredients for a killer innovation sandbox?
All right, so first, teams need scarce but secure resources. They shouldn't be showered with money and staff, but they do need enough to experiment effectively. And just as importantly, those resources need to be protected.
So no suddenly pulling the rug out from under them.
Exactly.
If another project comes up or if someone decides their idea is too out there,
Right.
makes sense. You need that stability to really explore those ideas. What's the second attribute?
Okay, the second one is that they need independent authority to develop their business. This means being able to make decisions quickly, move fast, without having to get approval from multiple layers of management. The sandbox has to operate with a different set of rules than the rest of the company.
Otherwise, it defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly.
Right? If they're constantly waiting for permission, they'll lose that agility and speed that, startups thrive on.
Yeah.
Okay, so scarce but secure resources, independent authority. What's that third element?
All right, so the third crucial attribute is a personal stake in the outcome. Team members, they need to be invested in the success of that project, not just treating it like another assignment.
So it's about getting them emotionally invested, giving them skin in the game.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but how do you actually do that?
It often means offering them some kind of equity or ownership in the venture, even if it's within, a larger organization. This aligns their incentives with the success of the project and gives them a real sense of ownership.
So you're creating a mini startup within the larger company,
Right.
complete with its own culture and incentives. That's brilliant. But then what happens when a sandbox experiment proves itself? How do you integrate it back into the main company without, like, stifling its innovation?
That's a great question. And it is a delicate process,
Yeah.
but the key is to do it gradually, preserving the team's autonomy and protecting what made them successful in the first place. So Rees actually suggests that the sandbox should ideally expand over time rather than being abruptly shut down.
So as the team validates their ideas and gains traction, the sandbox might, like, grow
Right.
to encompass more resources, more customers,
Yeah,
and eventually become, a full-fledged business unit within the company.
exactly. It's an evolutionary process, not a revolutionary one.
Right.
It's about creating a system that allows these disruptive innovations to flourish without, undermining the company's existing operations.
Wow, this whole concept of the innovation sandbox,
Yeah.
it's incredibly powerful. It's like creating a safe space for those crazy ideas to blossom and potentially transform the entire organization, right?
Well, it really is. And that's really the essence of the lean startup approach. It's not just a set of tools or techniques. It's a mindset, a philosophy, a way of thinking that can be applied to any endeavor where you're trying to create something new under conditions of uncertainty.
So what does this all mean for our listener? What's the big takeaway from our deep dive into the lean startup?
I think the most important thing is to remember that success is not a destination, it's a journey.
I like that.
And it's about constantly experimenting, learning, and adapting along the way.
And the lean startup gives us the framework,
It
the
does.
tools, and the mindset to help us navigate that journey.
Absolutely.
So whether you're launching a tech startup or trying to improve a process at your current company,
Yeah.
those lean startup principles can help you move faster, learn more effectively, and ultimately achieve greater success.
It's about embracing experimentation, learning from those failures, and constantly adapting to a world that's in constant flux.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up our deep dive into The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. We hope this has sparked some new ideas and given you some practical tools to apply in your own life and work.
And if there's one thing to remember, it's this. What could you test with an MVP? What assumption are you making that you could challenge and learn from?
Get out there, experiment, and embrace the journey. Until next time, keep learning, keep building, and keep disrupting.